Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to JWA's inaugural film club. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm really happy to be back with you tonight for the second session of our new series. Please, as always, say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to see who's in the room with us. That's also where you can add questions throughout our conversation. We love to open up the floor for questions and comments, and we'll bring those in. We are so delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world for meaningful learning and discussion. Last week's conversation on Yentl was really fun, and I'm very excited for tonight's discussion about a very different kind of film, a documentary, but one that shares some themes of secrets, deception, and identity. Before we begin our conversation, I wanted to say a few words about JWA for anyone who's new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories in all of their diversity. And we believe that uncovering a more nuanced and diverse story helps us create a better world. So we offer many different opportunities for bringing the lenses of history and gender to the issues of our time. And these virtual programs are just one aspect of our work. I hope you'll check out jwa.org to explore the broader range of projects and resources that we offer. On a very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click the CC button at the bottom, which should be, yes, it's already been enabled. Excellent. And that way, that should hopefully work for you. So tonight, I am really thrilled to welcome Lacey Schwartz Delgado back to JWA. Lacey is an award-winning producer, writer, director, an outreach strategist who draws on her interdisciplinary background to create compelling stories that span documentary and fiction. And she also works with innovative organizations and brands. Little White Lie, her directorial debut, which we'll be discussing tonight, has been distributed worldwide. She was also the executive producer of the narrative film Defret and the American Masters documentary How It Feels to Be Free. And she directed and produced the viral digital series The Loving Generation for Topic.com. It is so great to have you with us tonight, Lacey.
It's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I loved when we got to talk about this film when it came out several years ago, and it was really fun to and really interesting to revisit it several years later. And but tell us a little bit, maybe for most people, hopefully have watched the film, but maybe tell us a little bit about the film and how you decided to explore your story through documentary.
Absolutely. So I first started making this film actually when I was in law school at Harvard, living not far in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And, at the time, this film is about my experience growing up in a white Jewish family in upstate New York, in Woodstock particularly. And finding out at the age of 18 that my biological father was Black, due to the fact that my mother had an affair and no one had talked about it. But I grew up very much knowing that I looked different from my family and getting a variety of explanations about why that was the case. And so I found out when I was 18 the truth about my paternity and my race, but then lived in what I consider to be a racial closet for the larger part of a decade. And not until I was in my late 20s did I decide that I really wanted to go through the process of uncovering these family secrets that I'd lived with for so long that not only my father and I hadn't even talked about, nor anybody else in the family except for my mother and I. So I decided to film the process of actually uncovering the family secrets and my process of learning to live with my dual identities of being both Black and Jewish, and had made a student film about kind of that process of living in that racial closet, and then realized that I had to go through a process and I wanted to film it. Although backing up a little bit, I had actually started off thinking I was going to make a broader film at first about Black Jews in America, but really still through a personal lens in a sense of me trying to understand how to internally integrate my identities of being both Black and Jewish, because I had grown up in a space that had, for all intents and purposes, really kind of projected the idea that being Jewish was pretty much synonymous with being white, that there was more assimilation into whiteness than really this idea of how can you be Black and Jewish? And I felt like in order to understand what that was like for myself, I had to go through a process of understanding how other people were internally integrating those identities. And I did do a lot of that work, but the film itself, I realized that I could do all of that work, but until I dealt with my family secrets, I was never going to actually be able to internally integrate my identities. And the last thing I'll say about that is just, I think what really set me on this journey was to realize that the very personal experiences is so often how we do process, I think, even bigger societal issues. And that until we can go through that very personal journey, it is very hard to reconcile what's happening outside of us in the larger society.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot as I was watching the film and just thinking about the world today. And we'll get back to that for sure. How long did it take you to make the film?
I mean, I started thinking about it forever ago, but really, for all intents and purposes, 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
I really started in 2006, and the film came out in festivals and then in theaters in 2014, 15. And on 15, it was on TV.
And one of the things as I was watching again, I was really struck by your parents' participation in the film. And, on the one hand, one of the strong themes of the film is that they never really talked about what was going on in your family. But then they were fairly willing to open up on camera. I mean, there was a lot that you were documenting a process, right? So you were seeing a lot sort of unfold. How was it hard to kind of, once you decided you wanted this to be personal, was it hard to figure out how to make it your story and also incorporate these personal pieces of other people's lives as well?
Yeah, I mean, the way I went about doing it was really to say to my family, I'm setting out on this journey, and I'd love, to even my extended family, I'd love you to be a part of it, that no one person has to be, and then I'm going to do a film about my life, and I'd like you to participate in it, but you don't have to. And there were various moments where people didn't want to participate, and therefore didn't. And I think that was like a big journey that I went through, is just to realize that one of the hard things, about being a child, also about being a parent, is that you're inextricably linked, right? That you really are completely connected. And this idea that in telling my story, I, in a sense, had to tell, in particular, my parents' story to a certain degree. But I went through a lot of that process of figuring out, well, what is my story to tell, or what is my parents' story to tell? And really felt like it was important to toe that line. Mm-hmm. Because I do have my own story, but my parents are going to make a film, they would make a different film, and it would tell in a lot of ways a different, connected, but a different story. And so I also always say that I'm like to count all of my privileges in life. And I feel like one of the biggest privileges I've experienced is coming from a family, as you suggested, that was not always perfect, but that nonetheless was in fact loving and supportive. And I think that they all in the end did support me going through this process.
One of the things that you say so articulately in the film is, for all of the questions that you're pursuing about your identity, that your Jewishness was never in question for you. And that, that the question you were kind of grappling with is, what does it mean to be Jewish and Black, and how you can inhabit both of those identities fully everywhere and not sort of live a life where you're segregated in some way. Can you talk a little bit about what it takes to make that possible? And I'm wondering also whether you feel like in the 8 years since you finished this film, whether there's been any progress in the Jewish community for making space for that kind of integrated identity and recognition that there are so many Jews of color, and we don't want Jews of color to be leaving, parts of their identity at the door.
Yeah, and that's a big question. I think that part of it is, it's obviously, as I said before, it's like very personal, right? And so growing up, as I think I, really outlined, especially in the beginning of the film, that I kind of knew who I was through who my family was, right? And I think, for many people, so I'm just answering on the personal side first before I talk about, how the community is done. I just think identity is so interesting because in a lot of ways, what my story represents is kind of this ultimate coming of age story where you grow up and you are who your family is. And then you go out on your own and you almost become who you are in opposition to who your family is. And then the ideal is that you can reconcile those two bits of yourself together, where you come from with who you are as an individual. And I just think it's like, now that I'm myself a parent, my kids are 9, you definitely get to understand the cycles, right? Like the cycle of life and the cycles of like, you know, I was somebody's parent, then I become somebody's, I was somebody's child, and then I become an individual, and then I become somebody's parent, and then how that person looks at me. And so I think in a lot of ways that also reflects how much Judaism has been familial for me.
Mhm.
But then there was also phases where it was also really personal for me. And so I think it's also reconciling those pieces. You know, it's interesting because then you ask, the question you're asking in a sense is communal. And I think that I've done a lot of work in the Jewish community. I think for me, my relationship to Judaism has been largely either personal or familial.
Mhm.
And it hasn't been as much that, I mean, I've done a lot of work in the Jewish community and I appreciate it. And there are certain Jewish communities that I really appreciate in my life, but it hasn't always been as communal. I think part of it is I grew up in an area which at the time had like a burgeoning Jewish community. And there was a brief period of time where I was like president of NIFTY at a local temple and those kinds of things. But just because of my identity journey, it's been a little bit different. And I think though, what I will say is, yeah, I do think, you know, I think the question when you ask, like, has it gotten better? I guess the question is better in whose eyes. But what I will say is that that I think community has grown, that communal part has grown, even just for Jews of color. It is not something that is an absolute in any way. And I think different people are looking for different things in the community. But I do think as a community, I mean, we're still, you know, what it really means to internalize multiple identities as a community is a really complicated thing. And I think there's always more progress to be done.
For sure. But I also think that your film has contributed to the discourse in the Jewish community about just sort of recognizing how complicated identity is, how much Jewish communities, despite the diversity of the Jewish community, especially globally, but even in the United States, where, you know, somewhere between 15 and 20% of Jews identify as Jews of color, and certainly many more people than that are part of multiracial families, just sort of opening the conversation to recognizing that the assumption that Jewish and Black are two separate identities, you know, that they don't coexist within people, that's not the case for so many people, and that people can grow up like you did, very identified Jewishly and also be Black, and, you know, have that be part, you know, not have that be a conflict, except perhaps communally.
One of the things that always fascinates me about race is that it's frequently feels, I mean, obviously it being a social construction, but one that informs our lived realities, and that how much it is such a big part of the identity in particular. I mean, if we're just talking about the Black and white kind of paradigms, like on that kind of binary, that, you know, for Black people, it's such a big part of their lives, and that for white people, a lot of times it is not. And which was one of the things that was interesting to me about making this movie, which is that it's a film that is, you know, not solely, but also really deals with race, but it's largely with all white people.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And so just that idea of, you know, because I think in the Jewish community, a lot of times, like, we're talking about Jews of color, we talk about inclusion, we talk about these things, but I think we're also dealing with, you know, looking at the Jewish community and you know, some of the ideas about assimilation into whiteness, especially in an American space, and how does that affect different parts of the Jewish community?
Right. And sort of how, you know, how do you both complicate and make visible Jewish whiteness, and also, you know, to be able to talk, to recognize where white Jews are experiencing whiteness and kind of call that out as something that's not invisible because it is, you know, race as much as any kind of race, but also not, and I feel like sometimes some of the debates about Jews and whiteness wander into a territory that actually gets away from thinking about race more broadly in the United States, and instead starts focusing on Jewish difference.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes almost this kind of like internal thing about, like, are white Jews actually white or not? And it instead of kind of interrogating the whole notion of race and all the way we understand categories and thinking about it historically, it just becomes this like question about how much do Jews get to distance themselves from white privilege if they are white.
I mean, I think like with, identities are both fluid and they are also contextual, and so I think a lot of it comes down to that. So I think that also really does affect how, and so it's also if somebody can also understand their context versus like, do we all have a fixed perspective on who we are in society or this universe, et cetera, like it really does evolve in different spaces.
Right. And it's not right. It's not static. It's not static over a lifetime. It's not static over context. Identity is really complicated in race, particularly, especially because there's such different concepts in different places, right? So like for American Jews, race might mean one thing that is so different from how race is understood in other parts of the globe. And I think that was another thing that was a really interesting piece in your film, is you talk about how you come to understand being biracial as a category of Blackness, not of whiteness. And obviously that has a long history in terms of the one-drop rule of racial identity in the United States. And I'm curious whether that, whether sort of as you've gone through making this film and your journey, whether you think there is a different kind of discourse now about multiracial identity as it becomes clear that the United States is heading towards having multiracial identities as a majority, and just much more acknowledgement of multiracial identity in Jewish spaces too.
So sorry, what is the question? Do I think of it as what?
Your understanding of sort of your biracialness as part of Blackness, and this kind of separation between biracial as a category of Blackness, but not as a category of whiteness.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's personal. So it's like, I define that for myself, not for other people in any way. I'm, very aware that other people define it for themselves differently. For me, no, it doesn't change. It hasn't changed. I mean, I think that, again, it's like, you have to look at it, like the binary as always being on this, like, it's always on this like white spectrum. Right. And so is it about something getting, like a more proximate to whiteness? Obviously you mentioned I did that project of Loving Generation about the generation of people born with one Black and one white parent as self-defined after Loving v. Virginia. And it was so interesting. I mean, obviously there's a variety of different ways that people identify, but just that idea of these people who in a sense were kind of really living on like the color line. But it wasn't, I mean, listen, it's not like there weren't multiracial people going back hundreds of years. It's just all about how we define it in different ways. And one of the things I think is interesting, if you actually look at, as I've heard it, the history told to me, is if you actually look at the movement of like the multiracial movement, it is one of the few identity movements that was actually founded by people who are not actually members of it. It was actually founded by largely white mothers. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the things you start to see for some of, this love, as we so named it, this Loving Generation, is that there were very frequently, biracial people being born. They were just not being raised in white families. Mm-hmm. And so that started changing when there was more relationship with their actual white families than there were going back to previous decades and centuries. So again, I think part of it is like this contextual thing that sometimes it's not even, I'm not arguing with the demographics or like what the census says per se, but I do think that part of what we always have to look at is this, that it is actually like a sociological reality. It's not a biological reality.
For sure. And true in the Jewish community too. There have been multiracial Jews also for forever, right? And in America for centuries. But if they were associated, sort of accepted by the Jewish community, then they basically kind of folded into the whiteness of the majority of that community. And we can kind of identify them as multiracial historically, but they weren't necessarily identified that way. I mean, they would have been at a certain point, and then somehow in their communities, they kind of, that piece of their identity became sort of subsumed in their identification with the Jewish community in the United States. So it's really complicated, and it's really interesting to go back and kind of pick up those stories and think about like, how how do we even talk about it? Like, what language do we even use if that wouldn't have been the language that they necessarily would have used to describe themselves?
Right, because it's like we talk about like hierarchies of identity like within society, but there's also hierarchies of identity within individuals, right? Where some people prioritize something, one identity over others.
Right. You mentioned that I know you have twins and you said they're about 9 now. I'm curious how being a mother has affected your, sort of how you think about this story and your own sense of yourself.
I mean, I was a much easier child than my children are. I think that, I do think it's interesting to think about how, I mean, well, one of the things is I'm an only child by my parents and I have identical twins. And so I will just say as an aside, it's a very, I don't know how many of you either are an identical twin or no identical twins or have identical twins, but I mean, that in and of itself is like such an intense identity. So I will say that that's probably one of the most affecting things of my parenting experience is having these identical twins and what it is like going out into the world. That is like, that feels like that is their primary identity.
Right.
But it is like when you just look at, parts of yourself in a child and how they react to things, and you're just trying to kind of regulate as an individual. I mean, there's, as many people see, I feel like many people love the scene where my mother talks about who she was and she was a woman, so I think there is that. I mean, being a parent is so all encompassing and so overwhelming at times. And so then you think about, what decisions people make and are they for personally, or are they not? And, how can you be yourself and a parent at the same time? I think those are a lot of the things that like I can relate to. I mean, I certainly, even more so than being a parent, I really thought about it when I was getting married. I was editing this film while we were planning our wedding, and it was really meta, to say the least. Like, it was just this like really double conscious thinking about like, as I say in the film, this whole idea of kind of going out and starting my own family and what does that look like? And I think a lot of starting family does come from that foundation of who you are as a couple. And I think for my parents, one of the reasons I thought it was so important at the beginning of the film to kind of explore how they came together was because that was kind of the foundation of what our family was built on, this idea of, kind of this upwardly mobile, like appropriate match that made sense, that my grandmother approved of, all of those things really did feed into this vision that they were creating of who we all were. So I think in a lot of ways, when I think about my family, I think about, listen, as a parent, and just somebody who, exists in, these little towns, these little like kind of communities, it's just so fascinating how people play it into their own like paradigms, right? It's almost like people are like playing into these roles of like who you're supposed to be or what life is supposed to be like. And I don't think that has changed. I don't think that that's like an old-fashioned thing. I think people are still doing it. I think it's still really hard for people to be honest about who they are. I mean, we just went through a global pandemic, and so we saw a lot of people having a reckoning at various points. But I think that now we're back to a fair degree of normalcy. And I think people slip back into it because it's a lot of work and it feels easier. And I think it feels scary to sometimes have the very real conversations.
Yeah, I was very struck by the piece you're talking about with your mom, both in terms of when she talks about what was expected of her and kind of following the path that was laid out for her, which is like a very typical kind of gendered thing of people who grew up in the 50s and 60s, of just feeling like, the idea that you could step off the path was just, that was it felt like less of an option, I think. But the part where she says, like, before I was your mother, I was a person, is just, it's such a great encapsulation of that tension between what it is to be a parent, and particularly, I think, a mother, in terms of the ways in which maybe there are different expectations of women to kind of subsume their selfhood to their children. And just, that it can be really like, it's just such a clear naming of like how it can be hard to be true to your individual desires and to your family commitments. And that battle to kind of between doing what you think you're supposed to be doing and doing what you feel like doing, even if that's not what you're supposed to do. And that was incredibly beautiful. And I think a moment of like real compassion and just on it was so interesting in a film about like trying to get to the truth. There was like such clarity in that moment of what the truth is. And it's not an easy truth. And it's not a truth that like solves anything really. It's just like naming that human challenge of what it is to be wrapped up in other people's lives, but not want to lose something of yourself, or what it is to try to assert something in yourself if you feel like you've lost it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think part of what it also says is like, sometimes people just live life. They also don't stop and evaluate. I mean, I'll be honest, I probably do, but I'm also like, kind of a trip up I've learned probably the hard way. But,
Right.
I think a lot of people just let life pass them by. I mean, it's pretty fascinating, right? How people, I mean, not to get all like, philosophical about it, but I think that, we, people don't really live lives in the sense that, we are mortals and, we are, that you're actually have agency sometimes more than you even think you do. I mean, obviously there are some people who have less agency than others, but that we have a certain degree of agency. And I think that, and I think for women, it continues to be hard in that sense, right? Because so many people I know just feel like, they're just kind of on the, hamster wheel, and it's hard to get off, and it's hard to take a breath, and it's hard to do all those things. And I think for somebody like my mother, I mean, not to overly psychoanalyze her, but she's a fascinating in the ways in which she compartmentalized, right? How you kind of figure out to get what you need in different ways, and just to like keep all the trains running.
Right. We have a question from Sabrina actually about the sense of expectations from your family, and whether your parents kind of had expectations for, because they had followed the expectations that were set for them. Did they have an expectation that you would do the same, or did their experience give them more of a sense of leniency for you that you could create your own path?
Definitely. I mean, I think also, I mean, you have to keep in mind that like my parents, although we're still, I mean, I don't know if I'd say traditional. I mean, it was all relative, right? They were like, in Woodstock, we were relatively
right.
fair, but, again, it's all relative. But they were, I think, they'd opted out of a certain life to a certain degree, right? They'd moved out of the city, they had moved upstate, they wanted a different life. They built a house really truly in the middle of like nowhere. And so they wanted a different life. So they weren't raising me or had any, ideas at all of like, what they were. I mean, I was the only Jewish kid in my entire elementary school. So they didn't have, they were not, focused on being a certain part of society or doing certain things in a way that probably my mother's parents were more. So, I mean, listen, don't get me wrong, like all of their friends were very similar to them. They were all like, white Jews who also grew up in the 5 boroughs, who then moved upstate and were some sort of like upstate professional. But nonetheless, I think that was like a relatively, again, outside the box way to live.
Right. It was a break for them.
Yeah.
Even if they were not alone in making that break.
Exactly.
And do they still live in that area?
Yeah, as do I.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I've actually moved back home, and I mean, not literally into my parents' house, but I moved back to the Hudson Valley, the area I grew up on, right across the river.
Nice. I want to talk a little bit about the power of denial, which I think is so huge in the film. And part of what I think makes the film really interesting is like you're exploring all of this personal stuff about race and about identity. And then you're also, it's these kind of overlapping circles of also just exploring what it is to like not see things and not talk about things and pretend things aren't happening. And like you were on this journey of your own, but to have the broader conversation, to fight against the denial, you had to engage other people in it. And I'm curious if you feel, I mean, again, I know, of course, like you can't speak for anyone but your own family. But as I was watching the film, I was thinking like, it seemed that there were echoes to me sometimes in other Jewish stories, that there are ways in which maybe Jews have had to compartmentalize sometimes to survive. And I was wondering if you felt like there was a Jewish experience that was baked into some of that piece around secrets and denial.
I mean, it's interesting because like I thought when I first started making this film, I wondered, how, I mean, I knew that mixed identity was relatable. And I did think that family secrets was relatable to many people, but in the experience of, I mean, it's now been 8 years of almost 10 years, 9 years now that the film has been out, and I've literally traveled with it all over the world to like 4 different continents with it. And it's fascinating to me how many people relate to it, how like that deep idea. I mean, even when I did we did a trip with the State Department to Israel, and we were like in southern Israel in a university, and there was like a Bedouin student who's like, was talking openly about their family secrets in this classroom setting. And I just think, another screening I did in India where somebody stood up and somebody stood up and said, I think my father is just like your father. I did a screening in an all-girls school in Taiwan where a little girl was talking about her family secrets and how strong it is and how she can't talk about her identity. So I think that I really do think family secrets is probably a part of almost every culture, unfortunately. And that I think it just is so relatable in a way that is just feels very specific, because there is a specificity to it, right? And so it was interesting because when I thought, I was very intentional, especially when the film first came out, about, showing in this kind of all different kinds of festivals, like go to Jewish festivals, Black film festivals, anthropological, just broad festivals, and that, in certain audiences, like different people would relate to different things. And what I found is that you really can't tell how somebody's going to relate to the film just looking at them, because you don't know what their story is or what their experience is. And it really does, it runs deep, but it also affects so many different communities.
And I can totally imagine that the secrets piece played, resonated for people across the globe. Were there places where you took the film where the kind of thread about race and Blackness and Jewishness, where that just didn't compute for people? Or is there something, even in places where racial identities are defined differently, did that still translate cross-culturally?
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of people don't understand America and race. Like, I think especially because, I've done a lot of work with the State Department around this film. We did a program called American Film Showcase, where we go out and do kind of that, like as an American kind of a cultural diplomacy. And it was particularly interesting actually to do it when Obama was president, because people were just confused. They kind of thought that, it was like racial equality had been achieved when Obama became president internationally. And that was a lot of what they were seeing, is they didn't really understand how to talk about race in a way. So it was different. Like, but then when I went to Brazil with the film, it was actually right around the time of like Oscars So White. And they were super, like, it's really like Brazilian racial politics is really interesting, because obviously they've had, kind of a very racialized reality for a long time, but they're actually, and I think to a certain degree, this happens sometimes in the continent of Africa too, where it's like, they're looking, but Brazil is different actually than the continent of Africa, but Brazil, like, they're actually looking at the United States and how the United States has processed and fought with racial issues, and they're getting to a certain degree inspiration from it. So it's really interesting for me, especially with the film community and going there as again doing cultural diplomacy work, talking to Brazilians and Brazilian filmmakers who are struggling with racial issues and all, because when I was there, that's like 4 or 5 years ago, but it was like, they were talking about like kind of being farther behind in the sense of like, well, Black characters on TV are all maids and this and that. So they were looking at some of the places that we were and feeling like we were a few years ahead of them. And so looking for inspiration into how some of those racialized politics were going down. So it kind of depends on where you are and how people are seeing it and experiencing it.
Mm-hmm. And what about in Israel? How did people receive it in Israel?
I mean, Israel is, I'm sure many of you are aware, is like complicated. I mean, I think that different people just received it different ways. You know, we did do screenings. I mean, we did a screening of like all Ethiopians at the embassy at one point. We did, I just think that like, you know, I think in the end, like people talk a lot about, I mean, I saw the question, I've been to Israel about, I think like 5 times or so. And I think that, you know, people a lot of times talk about Israel's diversity, and I think it is a real thing, but I also think that it's dealing with racialized issues as well. And so I think just, you know, it's like people who say that, you know, they live in New York City and so they're so aware of diversity, but New York City is one of the most segregated cities in the entire, you know, country. So I think that just because like something exists doesn't mean that there isn't issues that are happening and occurring. And I think Israel, just like any other place, is struggling with that.
Sure. So I was thinking about how, like, you know, this film came out 8 years ago, and it's been a time of so much social flux, especially around race. And I'm curious whether when you watch the film now, whether, you know, have the events of the last several years kind of shifted your perspective on the film, or how, you know, how you told it, or, you know, sort of do you have a kind of different lens on it now?
I mean, I don't personally. I mean, I guess I only do in the sense that, like, you know, it's my journey and where I am in my journey, but it's not like a different perspective. I mean, it's a phase of my journey. I mean, I think in terms of, you know, I'm not sure I think of us as that different in terms of race. I mean, what's fascinating about the film is actually, in fact, how evergreen it is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how, you know, like there's, I mean, even like if you look at people, if let's say people have like an awakening with regards to race, right? Well, it's also even fascinating that they didn't have it before, right? I mean, like a lot of people had, you know, a really hard time. Obviously, like George Floyd was this huge moment. Like for me, bigger moment as a parent, I'm not saying that George Floyd wasn't a big moment, but it was a huge moment, was in 2016 with Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and how that, long story short, was just affected me for weeks in this really intense way. And but yet other people, it was fascinating to me at the time because other people, was like they weren't affected at all. Mm-hmm. So I think in a lot of ways we're dealing with people being in their, you know, bubbles and being in their journey. So, you know, I guess when I think about my film, honestly, it just feels like I think it's just about when people watch it, because it's less about me, right? And it's really about the audience and when somebody watches it and what they get out of it. Because, you know, with me, it's like, oh, well, yeah, that was where I was 10 years ago, right? Right. And I've gone through all these other things. So I look at that as like an important part of my journey, but I don't look at the film itself any differently.
Right. Yeah. To me, when I was watching it again, because I hadn't seen it for several years, I felt like the message of just, or it's not really the right word, you know, the kind of call that you were making in the film, that like, we cannot look away from the things that we don't want to see, felt so much, even, not that it didn't feel resonant at the time, but like it felt even so much more like key to describing what is happening in America, or what needs to happen in America. Like it felt like this kind of, it felt very much like your personal story, but also that it was kind of this microcosm of the process that America has kind of been going through, of like trying to come to terms with the things that white people haven't wanted to acknowledge about like what America is, what it's based on, and the kind of message of like, you can't look away, you can't ignore it, you can't just kind of pretend this isn't real or happening, felt like, oh yeah, this is still so much the kind of undercurrent of what's happening in terms of conversations around race in the US, or what needs to happen. But it felt very like loud and clear to me, and I appreciated that so much.
Thank you.
One of the things that I think was also so interesting that I was thinking about while I was watching the film again is the way that you're, because of the particularities of the story, that you're kind of really having to like shake up your family in joining you on this journey of exploring your identity and kind of coming to terms with your racial identity. I think, you were sort of, it was an interesting way of raising that issue of kind of like, what is the role of family in helping us understand who we are and helping, like, making us who we are, and helping us kind of like form our identities. And then also there's so much of the story that's about your peer group and sort of how, especially in college, you find a group of people who kind of help you talk through, and you have such great scenes in the film of actually like the conversations you're having with your friends as you're sort of working through stuff. And that was also really interesting to me. And I think about this also as a parent, sort of like, how much do we actually shape our kids and who they are, and how much is that happening like with their peers? And so I was curious how you think about that, sort of in terms of like, what is the role of friends in helping you figure out who you are, and what is the role of family, and sort of how do those relate?
Yeah, I think, and also to a certain degree, it's like different phases of your life. Like a lot of times, like I'll go to do a screening at a college, and somebody will be talking to me about, some issue they're having with their parents, or they're working through who they are. And one of the things I say to like kids who are in college is like, this isn't necessarily the time where you have to work everything out with your parents. Like this is kind of a time for you to do you. And that, I think that when you get out of college, when you're in your 20s more, that is, and you're kind of trying to resolve it. Because I do think this idea of, how many people do we all know who like either want to get married or don't want to get married or scared to get married because of what they've seen their parents go through, And so I think that is like a lot of your 20s, again, this is all overgeneralizations, but to a certain degree, there are, certain trends of this, like, that you're working through who you are, right? And so I think that again, I have like little kids who are constantly telling me that like we're controlling them, but then at the same time they don't do anything for themselves, so we're saying to them all the time, like, you say you want independence, but then you don't actually want to put on your shoes yourself, so how do you reconcile those two things? I don't think it actually just becomes, as they say, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. And I think that that's, what ends up happening. So when you go out on your own, and this thing of like, how am I, as I said before, like kind of how am I relating to it? So I think it depends on those different pieces of your life. And how, and again, like, because it's not just the family you come from, it's also then the family you build, and how those families work together becomes such a big part of all of that. So I think it's like different phases. I mean, I'm really into my friends, as you can see, and I think that they are a big part of it. And especially for me, when that was my identity. Like when it came to, when you see all those scenes in my film about, coming to terms with my Black identity, and how much of that was about that community element of, in particular, being in college, and then even coming out of college, and where, how, because college is such an interesting time as well, where, it is, again, can be fairly segregated by all different kinds of identities. And so, but then it's also a time where people like kind of dip in and out of different spaces. I mean, I think it's getting
try on different identities.
Yeah, I mean, in certain ways it's getting like freer, right? People are being more released from identity, but then at the same time, I think for kids these days, it's like also getting, these identities are even more trapping than they were before. I mean, it's the whole obviously idea of like, can we make mistakes, and can we change, and can we evolve, and what is the safety net for failing? And so many obviously successful people talk about how important their failures are and making mistakes, but does society support that in the way that it should?
Right. You talk in the film about keeping your Black and white world segregated, and I'm curious if that's changed for you, how that's changed for you.
Oh yeah, it's 100% changed for me. I don't do that at all anymore. I mean, I live in a space that is, I live in upstate New York, which is a fairly, just by the numbers, it's like a 90+% white area. So that just is what it is. But no, my friends are like incredibly from like all different backgrounds, and then all mixed together. Not to mention, if you just look at our family alone, like we're super diverse. My kids have like, very, very diverse family, ton of grandparents, etc.
That must be fun for them to have lots of different
Yeah.
influences of different kinds.
Yeah.
Also, in the years since the film came out, you've had, in addition to the work that you're doing yourself, you also have been like on the political stage with your husband, Antonio Delgado, who is now the Lieutenant Governor of New York State, which is very exciting. What has it been like to be in the public eye in that way, and to be doing this work and, sort of be in that kind of political space?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because obviously, like, I was already kind of speaking my truths publicly before we got into politics. And I think then when you go into that space and you have to look at yourself and think, who am I? And so it's actually been, I think, really great to already very much feel like I know who I am before I came to that space. I think for both my husband and I, that this space is not necessarily, it's not one that's molding us, that we're coming into it kind of formed as who we are, already having our own voices. So, I mean, listen, politics is intense and it's nonstop. And I think the world keeps on churning and you don't know how to predict it. But I think, I think being a part of a public family is something you have to think really seriously about. And obviously more than I think about how will it affect my kids as they get older. I mean, they've really grown up in this space. They were 3 when we started, and it's really all they'll like kind of will have ever known. So that's something, as opposed to, again, we were fully formed before we came into it. Although, we live in a community where, we're very blessed to be part of a community where I think that they are able to form their own identities as well. But yeah, I think you have to be mindful, obviously, but it's also, I think it's fundamentally for me an extension of the work I feel like I was already doing, which was really about creating impact and being a bridge. And, for me, it's really through storytelling. For my husband, it's more through, legislation, and now he's in the executive branch, but it feels very connected for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. What are some of the things that you're working on these days?
Sorry, what am I working on right now? I'm actually just finishing something else up for American Masters at this moment. I did a project, my years all blurred together, as I'm sure you all can understand. I really sometimes can't remember if it's 2021 or 2022. Last year, give or take, about the interest for BET, about the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism.
Yes, that was fabulous. I watched that. It's great.
Thank you. Which was exciting because it was like doing something around those issues for a Black secular audience, which, I felt like I never had the opportunity to do that. We're also working, just finished production. It's going to be out soon on an episode on a documentary series that is coming out on Showtime on the pharmaceutical industry. We in particular produced an episode on the pill. And now we're in production on a documentary with PBS on reparations.
Wow, that's big.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
And are you still traveling around with the film and doing stuff with the State Department with it?
A little bit. And we're now in that same program with the film that I did. Again, God, my years are like, in 2021, I guess it was, on How It Feels to Be Free, which is about Black female performers and how they're activists on and off the stage and screen. So now technically we're in that, but actually during COVID, we did a ton of screenings. We did a ton of screenings through that department all over the world. So I did one with the Kuwait embassy, one in Colombia, one in Thailand. So it was really interesting, I think, just doing all of these Zoom conversations and how it's possible to do them just all over the world during that period of time. Yet now we're back to traveling more, but it's a little bit harder, as I don't have to tell. That's a whole other conversation.
Yes, I hear you. I have enjoyed being able to do my work from my house, and now starting to get back on the road, and my kids who don't like it that I travel and got used to me are like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Why do you have to go anywhere?
Yeah. And you're like, I actually don't know why.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's very hard to get off the couch, to be honest, when it feels like I could access the world this way.
Yeah.
Uh, let's see. I know there's some questions that have come in that I didn't pull in here. I know there were a couple of questions about, whether you've had, what your experience has been in Jewish spaces now as an adult. Have you had experiences of racism and microaggressions and things like that in your kind of encounters in Jewish communities? There are definitely some you describe in the film.
Yeah. I mean, I think microaggressions just exist.
Yeah.
They just exist, and I'm certainly have experienced them myself.
Mm-hmm. And have your kids, as kids growing up in a family that is doing Jewish stuff?
It's hard for me to evaluate that fully. I mean, again, I have 9-year-old kids who just spent like 3 years in a pandemic.
Right.
So
their context is very familial, I'm sure.
Right. And then honestly, when they go to synagogue locally, like, people do know who they are. So because again, we live in a small community, and people do know who our family is, I think, in those spaces. So it's a little bit hard to fully, and people are, I mean, again, I live in an area where I grew up,
You're a known quantity.
Right, we're like a known quantity here. And so I think there's a lot of familiarity.
Yeah, that makes sense. There were some questions also about, like, does your family, I mean, I'm sure for your parents, they're like, this film, you made it a long time ago and they've moved on. They're not like part of your ongoing work about it, but did it play an important role for them too, in terms of, kind of moving through your process and their process? Is it like a live thing for them, this film still?
For my father, I would say that he never, he participated in the process. He let me know that he was proud of me, supported me, but he always opted out of the process. Mm-hmm. And so I can't speak to how it has affected him, because we don't really talk about it. But in regards to my mother, she was definitely an active part of the, not as much anymore. I mean, every once in a while, she'll come to a screening or a talk or something like that. And I'm sure, I mean, listen, you have to also know my mother to know that, she owns a liquor store for the last 40 years. And if you walk into it, there's a shrine to me and my husband and my kids. And she definitely has the poster up. So, I mean, she's just a character. And so I think she's
playing up her Jewish mother role.
Yeah, she embraces the story. And I do think for her it was an overall positive experience. I mean, I don't know if, it's just part of people I forget sometimes that when I'm like, oh, if you met my mother, that a lot of people, even a friend of mine or somebody I know will be like, well, I'm familiar with her. I'm like, right, of course.
I know her deepest, darkest secrets now.
Right. So I think it's just, it's kind of who, I mean, again, I think it's part of just who she's evolved into, and that people know who she is. But we live in a series of very small communities. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also small town life.
Right.
We kind of all live in different ones, but we also have a lot of overlap and know a lot of people in each of them.
Yeah. I remember that you had a card game that went with the film. Is that still? Yes. Tell us a little bit about that and how that worked, and what you kind of learned from that.
So again, as I had said before, for me, a lot of it was about, a lot of just making films in general is about people using them as tools to further conversations. And really, it's a lot of times with films, I feel like it's the starting point is to say, is you watch the film and then what does it lead to? And so what we wanted to do is to use, we use quotes of the film and themes of the film to start other discussions. So we have an online and offline version. It's still up at truthcirclegame.com. We're using quotes in the film. You can insert your own experience, it's like a fill in the blank kind of online process. And then we had an offline discussion card game as well, where you would use after watching the film to talk about, the different questions and topics and sometimes quotes that are in the film.
we have used your film with our teen fellowship program, the Rising Voices Fellowship, and we use the cards with that as well. And I mean, it's perfect for lots of different audiences, but that was great for teens who were really in it with their identities and thinking about all these questions of like, who are they? Where do they come from? How are they different from their families? Who are they becoming? What parts of themselves are they not, able to access or express in the ways that they wanted to?
Yeah, I love that.
We have a question about Rodney, your biological father. And this participant, Sarah, is asking what his passing has meant to you long term.
Yeah, I don't think I understand the question fully. I'm reading it as well. And what his passing, I guess I don't understand what you mean by his passing.
I think his death.
Oh, I thought you meant in the other sense.
Not racial passing.
Yeah, I thought you meant in the other. Okay. What can I share? I don't actually know if I have such an answer to that. What his passing has been in the long term. I mean, I think, my relationship with Rodney was really complicated. It was even more so complicated by my mother's kind of ongoing relationship with him, and therefore not really having kind of the space to ever develop my own relationship. But he was also a complicated person in terms of what he valued and how he connected with people. So I would say a lot of it honestly hasn't really changed over the long term. I feel kind of like, a little bit neither here nor there about it. And I think of it in a lot of ways is really, he was somebody in my mother's life more than he was even in my life. It's kind of a character.
Right. Well, and it's interesting also, whenever anyone makes a film, it's like it captures a snapshot of sort of where you were and what you were thinking about at that time. And then with most of the people in the film, like your relationships have continued, right? Like you continue to evolve, you evolve in relationship to other people as well. But when someone is no longer there, there's less evolution that can happen. That being said, my mom is not alive, and I feel like I have very much like an ongoing, I often joke with my husband, like, I thought she and I would stop fighting once she died, and that turned out not to be true. I mean, there's lots of loving that continues as well. But
100%. I mean, I think that, part of it is also that I think, what your relationship is to people. Yeah, I always talk about like with adoption, right? Like some people feel a very strong connection to their biological parents or birth parents if they meet them. And some people don't at all, and so I think sometimes it's like we all have very different relationships with different people. And I do understand that even we're tormented sometimes by these relationships, but, going through a process, I saw a question earlier about like kind of what I took out of making this film. And I feel like going through the process of making this film is in the end such a gift for myself. And I really do believe, it's not that everybody's going to go out and make a film, but that the idea of having difficult conversations, the idea of working through things so that you can actually move forward with your life is so incredibly important. Because so often, I mean, even in mundane ways, so many of us just hold on to all of this like mishigas that just like weighs us down. And this idea that you can just like leave something behind, like say that is some, I've come to terms with it. I can now understand it. Even people ask me a lot of times, like, sometimes people watch the film and then they'll say, I was waiting for your mother to say, I'm sorry. And it's interesting because like they're waiting for her to say, I'm sorry, more than like what I was looking for was not to hear her say, I'm sorry. I was just looking to understand where I come from and how everything had happened so that I could move forward. And so I think for me, obviously I take things from a fairly intellectual approach to it, but I think that process can be really helpful. Just rather than trying to, sometimes I thought when I first started making this film, I was gonna have to work everything out with my parents. We're gonna have to be on the same page in order to move forward with their relationship. And what I came to realize is that actually sometimes the biggest part of it is actually just acceptance. And if you can learn, and for me, acceptance means comprehension, just to be able to wrap my mind around something. And then once I can kind of accept it and move forward.
Well, that is very wise. And thank you so much, Lacey, for this very powerful and important film and for speaking with us tonight and sharing your wisdom with us. And thanks to all of you who are with us in the room for joining the conversation. It's really wonderful to be together. And as always, there's more to explore at JWA. We'll put some links in the chat of some things you can follow up on. I mentioned Sarah Rodriguez Brandon, who's one of the earliest known American multiracial Jews. You can learn about her in our encyclopedia. We did a podcast episode about the recent survey that was done of Jews of color. We did an interview with Alana Kaufman of the Jews of Color Initiative, so you can check that out. We do story collecting at JWA. We have a question set about Judaism, race, and ethnicity, and you can share your own story there. And finally, I want to point people also, Lacey wrote a beautiful piece for JWA for our We Remember collection about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that we did after Justice Ginsburg's death. And so you can check that out as well. I hope many of you will join us next week, same time, same place, for a discussion of one of my very favorite movies, Dirty Dancing. We'll be joined by journalist and New York Times bestselling author Irene Carmon for that conversation. And you can watch that on Prime, Google Play, Apple TV, YouTube. You can rent it in lots of different places. So again, thank you, everyone. And until next time, be well and have a lovely evening. Thank you, Lacey. This was really fabulous.
Thank you again for having me. Talk soon.
Yes.